All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the Woodland Owner Webinar Series, hosted by My St. Croix Woods, which is a program of the St. Croix River Association. My name is Nikki Hanger, and I am the Forestry Program Coordinator. The My St. Croix Woods program is a partnership of multiple public and private organizations throughout the watershed whose goal is to provide landowners with the resources and tools to make the best decisions on their land. Before we begin the webinar, I would like to take a few moments to talk about the Zoom software. Please leave your camera off and remain on mute for the entire webinar. You can type your questions in the chat at the bottom of the screen. Just click on that and it will pop up. And actually, if you guys want to do that now, just to let me know if you can hear me, that would be great. You can just type in yes in the chat box if you can hear me. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you, guys. All right, we will answer questions after the presentation, but feel free to type them throughout the webinar. The webinar will be recorded and a link to the recording will be sent out in the next few days. I also have a survey in the chat box. Please fill out the survey to help us determine future webinar topics and also just to let us know how we are doing. All right, today's topics will be about protecting your oaks. We have two great presenters and also a very cool project that you could potentially get involved with if you are in the counties of Cass or Crow Wing in Minnesota. So Rachel Nickel from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, she is a regional forest health specialist based in Brainerd, will talk about the project and also some work the Minnesota DNR has been doing on oak wilt. So Rachel, I will stop sharing my screen and I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Nikki. So I will now share my screen and start my presentation. There we are. All right. So yeah, like Nikki said, I'm based out of Brainerd, and this is one part of Minnesota where we are now becoming very concerned about the possibility of oak wilt. It is not known yet to be in the counties of Cass or Crow Wing yet, but they very recently became part of what we consider the high-risk area for oak wilt, and that means it's within 20 miles of a known oak wilt infestation. So this year we worked with University of Minnesota Extension to create this cool citizen science reporting project. And this is a snapshot of the website. Here's a link right here. I'll share it on the next page as well if you want to check it out. They have a number of projects, but with this specific project, we're really hoping to have a number of eyes on the ground looking for oak wilt in these counties so we can proactively find them and then control them if possible. So we have some great resources for oak wilt ID information on when to report. We are asking for folks to report between now and mid-August. After that time, it can become pretty difficult to distinguish between other issues affecting oak trees. But we are focusing, as well as Nikki mentioned, on these two counties right now, Cass and Crow Wing. So I wanted to share all of this with you today. If any of you own property in that area or want to share this resource with folks that you know that might have land in these counties. And then this information applies to you wherever you live. On the right is how to report. We share two different options for reporting. One is an app. It is the Great Lakes Early Detection Network, or Glendon smartphone app. The next one is EDD Maps, online or on their app as well. They're both free. And the great thing about these resources is that you can share photos, location information, and if you make a report, they will go to a verified person in the agency managing for oak wilt. So it's a really slick way to report any suspect oak wilt. Another thing that I will mention is that for this project specifically, we are asking for reports on oaks in the red oak group or those with pointed lobes. Oaks in the white oak group, it can be much more difficult to properly detect oak wilt, and it often does require a laboratory analysis. Oh, sorry, and the link didn't come up. There's the link one more time. I'll pause if you want to take it down. Otherwise, you can just Google U of M extension stop oak wilt, and it should come up in Google search. But next, I did just want to highlight some work we're doing to battle oak wilt and its northward spread into Minnesota. So one thing that we're really excited about is that we were just successful in getting a U.S. Forest Service suppression grant for public lands along the northern edge of oak wilt. So you can see here, this is our map of the oak wilt high-risk zone. There are those areas going into Cass and Crow Wing County, as well as Pine and Carlton along the St. Croix River watershed. We were also last year able to use funds from the Environmental and Natural Resources Trust Fund, focus on Morrison County. We got these funds with Morrison County SWCD for controlling oak wilt on private lands. And the really great thing about those funds is that they were able to cover the full cost of controlling oak wilt on those private lands. The unfortunate thing was that oak wilt totally exploded in Morrison County. We weren't anticipating that, so we did go through all of the funds last year. However, we have applied for 8 times those funds this year, and we're hoping if we're successful in getting them, we'll be able to use them starting on July 1st. These funds can also be used in other counties along the northern edge of oak wilt in Minnesota. But in the meantime, the DNR does have some cost share dollars available to control oak wilt on private lands. Again, these only cover up roughly half of it, up to half. So it's not as ideal as this other source of money, but it's something in the meantime. And then very excitingly, we have just completed a oak wilt guide for Minnesota. This document has been in the works for years. Here's a link to it on the right. And sorry, there's really no great way to post that link, so it's a little bit hard to read. My apologies, but again, this is something, if you go to Minnesota DNR Forest Health webpage, you'll be able to find the oak wilt guide there. Here's a table of content seeing the array of topics we cover, and it shares a lot of great in-depth information. And with that, here is my info, just in case you have any questions for me. And thanks very much for this opportunity, Nikki, to share about this cool project, and I'll hand back control.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And also for those links, if you want to just put it in the chat box, feel free to do that, and so they can just click on it from there.
Excellent, will do, thank you.
Let me share my screen. Right. So our first speaker today will be John Geissler, who is the land manager at St. John's Abbey Arboretum and also the director at St. John's Outdoor University since 2017. Before this, he served for 10 years as the program director at Boulder Lake Environmental Learning Center in Duluth. John is passionate about oak regeneration, and today we'll talk about adaptive management for future oaks forests. And then John, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Great, thanks, Nikki. So now I'll just jump right in. This is one of my favorite oak trees here, this white oak. When I first started, the top blew off of it, and we went to start counting the age, and it ended up being 241 years old. So this was an acorn in 1776. Just gives you an idea of how long these oaks are on the landscape, and I'm really passionate about getting young oaks started for next generation. So this talk is really about our journey at St. John's with regenerating oak and some of the obstacles we've encountered and some of the solutions we've tried. So I'm gonna jump right in here. Just to give you an idea of where St. John's is, if you're not familiar, it's in the central part of the state. In the Avon Hills. It's a beautiful rolling topography. The glaciers deposited these moraines, and there's still a lot of big sections of oak forest, oaks and maples and northern hardwoods. You can see this cross-hatched area is about the 3,000 acres that St. John's Abbey owns and manages. So this next slide kind of shows the dark orange is where we have high concentrations of oak. There's about 700 acres that are primarily red and white oak. So my job is to maintain a healthy, resilient forest here. And to do that, you need a diversity of species, which we have. We also need a diversity of age classes, which is a real weakness of ours. As I zoom in here, most of our oaks are in the 120 to 150-year-old age range, and that's similar across Minnesota. There's only 6.5% of oaks in Minnesota are under 20 years of age. And the reason we have these 120 to 150-year-old oaks is as St. John's was getting established. I don't know if you can see those chimneys on top of the quad building there, but it was all heated by wood. So a lot of the area was harvested to provide that fuel for the young school. And without deer at that time, or any of the kind of the issues we're facing now, oak came back just wonderfully. So about 1997, Father Paul Schweitz started a lot of work, followed by Tom Kroll, on different treatments to get young oaks started. So these first efforts were done without deer protection. So kind of the standard silvicultural methods where you wait for a good acorn year. That winter you do a shelter wood cut. You kind of cut everything except for a few oaks to provide some shade, and then also to rain down oaks on the soil. This is about 60 basal area. This is kind of what a shelter wood cut would look like. And you get young oak seedlings. It works. You get a lot of oaks starting to come up. We then also did some prescribed burning to kind of knock back the competition. These are real rich oak sites, so mesic sites, where as soon as you allow sunlight to the forest floor, you have a lot of competition coming up. So did a little prescribed burning. We collected acorns, sent those to the DNR State Nursery, so they grew our own stock. So we supplemented natural regen with some artificial regen. And we got lots of young oaks. All these red ribbons are on oak trees. So it was working. We were starting to get a lot of oak. And then the deer come and eat everything. I mean, there's not a single one left that was not protected. And so what you end up with is, after all that work, is all these, what I call a failed shelter wood, where you have primarily ironwood, which the deer do not like to eat, and prickly ash, and hardly any other tree species coming up underneath these mature oaks that you left in the initial shelter wood. So then we moved, after we saw that, we moved to treatments with deer protection. So kind of the same methods, but we tried different deer protection techniques. So we tried the tree tubes with kind of scattered results. It seems like the ones near the edge or near that got more sunlight seemed to fare a little better than those that were in with the competition. We also then built deer exclosures ranging in size from half an acre up to 20 acres in size, and got some oak coming up, a lot of small oak. But this is kind of when I was hired. We were trying to figure out, kind of assess these different deer exclosures. And this was what I was finding a lot of, just a lot of understory competition, like raspberry, blackberry, prickly ash. There were little tiny oaks underneath, but they weren't vigorous. They were just kind of sitting there, and not, I'd say, deteriorating. So with time, just in that dense shade, there's just not a way to get through that. And this is me and some blackberries. So everything that has thorns is in these stands. So that, what I concluded was sunlight was the issue within the deer exclosures, down to the seedlings. So this is just a close-up image of all of our deer exclosures. So this is the big 20-acre deer exclosure, 4 acres. And what we've found on deer exclosure size is 20 acres is too big. Deer constantly get in. 4 acres is about right. If they can get around the outside, they don't have the pressure to get inside as much, or smaller. And so we divided up these deer exclosures into grids just so we could have small winds, and we started to mat individual oak seedlings just to get these are vispore mats that allow moisture through the top side, and they're just put down with landscape staples just to give those young seedlings a tube of light up through that competition. And then we've continued to do annual hand pruning around these with either buzzsaw or weed whackers. So we've tried a number of different things, full sunlight, under the shelter wood with these mats, and just kind of starting to compile the results. It's working. It's just a lot of work. As you can see how dense this is, it just takes a lot of time to go around those individual trees. But you can see on the left and right here, we're getting some nice oaks started. They're past the competition now, and they're good to go. There's some more images of how these are starting to take off. They're starting to get a hold, starting to get some light. And we're just kind of getting a whole crew of volunteers and students to help keep these oaks clear. And you can see this one's over 12 feet. So we're getting into the range where they're really starting to take off. So I start, now this is kind of the next phase. So I didn't want to build any more deer exclosures. They tend to stay on the landscape forever. And I just didn't want to cage in the entire woods. So this is kind of our next phase. We're starting to do working in those kind of failed shelter woods. I'm trying strip regeneration cuts. So we're cutting about 100-foot wide strip and then running north and south. And as we're going, we're taking the skidder and we're just taking the blade right at the ground level, pushing down all that ironwood, popping it out of the ground, kind of scarifying the soil here and there we do this in the fall and winter, so it's really working in those acorns into the ground. And then we're leaving a 100-foot strip of uncut failed shelter wood in between the strips. So the idea is in 7 to 10 years, when the oaks in this strip get large enough, we'll go and move our cages to the next uncut strip. So this is just to give you an idea what it looks like in the winter after we've harvested these north-south strips. We get a big crew of volunteers to cut cages. We're actually individually caging each oak tree. So we get 100-foot rolls and cut them into 2-foot diameter cages. And then we roll all those cages out into the cut area and get them staged, because it's a lot easier moving those cages in the winter as opposed to the spring or summer. And we get it all staged like this. And I was already at rebar with my welded wire. I was all ready we had seedlings ordered from the state nursery, and then COVID hit. So I thought, oh, I'm sunk here. The competition is going to get a jump on us, but we had a lot of natural regen started, luckily. You can see this acorn in the middle just starting to sprout. So we went around and we found all these acorns sprouting and just caged them right away. And you can see nature does just an awesome job of planting, and you can see this huge taproot coming out of the acorn before it even puts leaves on. And you can see all the oak regen we have here. Just one amazing regen. And then you just pick one and put a cage on it, because all the other ones are going to be eaten eventually. Just another obstacle we run into is this dodder parasitic vine that comes around. It wraps itself around plant material and kind of sucks them dry. So we've ended up putting cans from our dining service around to help with watering if we do any watering, or just protection from those vines coming up. This is kind of what it looks like now. We have our caged oak seedlings, about 240 per acre. And then at some point, I'll probably put the mats, Vispor mats on them. If you put them on too early, these mats, the seedlings tend to cook. Just too hot of a situation there. So we're still playing with when the right time is to put the mat on. This is not a commercial scale operation. I mean, it's very expensive. But for a landowner like a lot of the audience here, if you do a small area or even just protect the seedlings you have that are coming up naturally, that's a big deal if you're in a high deer density area. And just some quick pros and cons. On the deer exclosures, the pro is you're protecting more than just the trees. You're protecting those native plants that are on the ground layer. The cons are every windstorm we have to monitor those fences, and you could lose years of work if just one deer gets in there and you don't notice it. They could just take it down in a few weeks. The benefits of the cage or the strip methods, you can move these cages more than once, use them more than once. The deer actually do some work. They're actually chewing down some of the competition around all the cages. Another benefit is I have kind of oak wilt safety strips in place now. So if I get oak wilt in one of those 100-foot sections, I have buffer or kind of cut areas on both sides of that now. So I've kind of contained it. And then I don't have to re-enter that shelter wood to take the mature wood off the top after I get seedlings established. They're just free to grow as soon as they kind of get past the competition. And cons, of course, are this really high initial cost and labor, and it only protects the trees, not the herbaceous layer. I'm going to skip over that. And so just my take-home messages is if you're in a high deer density area, you have to not only protect the seedlings from the deer with cages or exclosures, and you have to control the understory competition. I think those are my big takeaways. You have to do both. You can't do one or the other. And this is our gift to the year 2261. If we get some of these, it seems like a lot of work, but I think it's really important that we get some young oaks started to make our forest more resilient for time. Thank you. So I'm going to turn it back over to Nikki.
Great. Thank you, John, for all that great information. Let me start sharing my screen. 1 second. There we go. Okay, so before we get to our next presenter, I want to remind everyone that if you have questions, please use the chat box, which can be found below. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Our next presenter today is Paul Cigan with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Paul has a bachelor's and master's degree in forest biology and management from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and the University of Alberta. He enjoys year-round recreation in the majestic Northwoods, and today we'll talk about oak wilt in Northwest Wisconsin. All right, Paul, take it over.
Great. Hey, Nikki, should we just try my screen real quick once more?
Yeah, of course. I'll stop
Let's
sharing.
just give that one more go here and see if we can get it to go.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to work for some unknown reason, so maybe you can switch back. At least we tried a couple of times.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I don't know what's up with that issue, but here, let me share my screen one more time. And then, yeah, just let me know when you want me to click, or I'll try to predict it.
Okay, sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to present today, Nikki, and the invitation. this has been about a year since my last presentation with the group, and it actually included oak wilt as a topic, but it was a little bit more broad in presentation. But I think today is a great day to talk about oak wilt in terms of the time in the season, and there is a significant date today on the July 15th, and I'll get into that a little bit down the road in the presentation. But I just wanted to put my contact information up on the last slide, and if anyone needs this at the end of the presentation, I can get that to you. But that is my telephone number, my work cell, and my email's there. It's pretty straightforward at wi.gov. And if you have any questions about oak wilt following the presentation, want to talk more, want to send photos, and you're in Northwest Wisconsin, I'm a great contact for that, and I can help you out. I just want to briefly introduce you then on the next slide, the forest health team that I work with. We have a broad assemblage of experts who help landowners and foresters at the county, state, and federal level. Feds help us, we help them diagnose and manage insect and disease problems. So next slide. Specifically on that team, we have regional forest health specialists, of which I am one, and I cover the northwest part of the state here. And I and my colleagues cover everything from phone calls and field visits related to gypsy moth and forest tent caterpillar and Tabacia leaf disease and oak wilt. So we cover pathogens, we cover insects, and we provide diagnostic services and also management recommendations. A lot of what we do is we talk to landowners about how the sky is not necessarily falling and that things are going to be okay. We help alleviate a lot of concerns that people have, and sometimes, maybe 50% of the time, there is a situation that can be addressed and ought to be addressed with a management or prevention strategy. Some of what we deal with is to help people understand that their nature is at work and it's probably not the end of the world for their trees. We get a lot of things like that too. So in any case, if you are in any of these other zones, those are your contacts for those zones regarding anything pest and disease related, and then also to some extent invasive plants. We can be point persons for that too, or at least refer you to other of our colleagues who handle more specifically invasive plant issues. I want to point out the Wisconsin DNR Forest Health webpage. The way to get there is to go on to, if you Google Wisconsin DNR, you can type into the major field forest health there. And then what you do is you'll come to our webpage where you can find a wide volume of information on different commonly found issues on Wisconsin's forests and trees. Things in the disease world, things in the insect world, and invasive plants. We've got guidelines here, we've got fact sheets here, we've got the staff contact list here. We've got a whole lot of information that helps you as a landowner in the process of initially identifying or filtering out what you may think it may be affecting your tree or may not be, and then resources there to help lead you along the way, and then ultimately our contacts if you need to bring in a little bit more horsepower on determining and managing the problem. So I just want to point that out. And then one thing I'll point out on the next slide here is that you can sign up for the Forest Health newsletter to get timely updates on regional and sometimes statewide occurrences that are happening with forest health issues. There's a lot going on in the forest health world. It's incredible. I can hardly keep up, and I'm supposed to be a specialist and an expert in this world, but there are a lot of strange things that are going on with trees, and they happen every summer, every spring and fall. We see sometimes things that have happened in the past that are fairly typical, and then sometimes new things pop up that we don't even know what they are or how to go about them, but we learn and we incorporate that information and help landowners diagnose and manage it along the way. An example is a region-wide needle tip browning that we saw in red pine. We're seeing it a little bit this year in northeast part of the state, less so in northwest Wisconsin. But through this newsletter, you would be sent an email with this information on articles with some really cool photos and information on how to manage and diagnose these problems on your trees potentially. And so this is a really good resource. It's about the cheapest way to become an expert that I've ever seen, because reading my colleagues' articles, boy, I learn a lot just from them. And I'm supposed to know a lot already, but it's pretty amazing. So the way you get to this sign up is on the next slide here. Oh, somehow it didn't get in there. But if you go back to the last slide, what you do is you go onto the DNR's homepage, Wisconsin DNR. On the very bottom there, and I'll send a link. I'll try to put in a link on the chat room. There's an envelope icon. If you click on the envelope icon at the bottom of the DNR homepage, you'll come up to an area where you can put in your email and then select what newsletters from DNR you want to receive. And in this case, it would be the Forest Health newsletter. You can select which region you're most interested in, or you could select statewide in the case that you wanted articles that have relevance across the whole state, because maybe the thing we're writing about, like basswood thrips, is affecting basswood and linden across the whole state. So you have a little bit of an option on how to sort through that preference. But anyway, we'll keep going on here with the actual topic of oak wilt, which is just starting to flare up. I've been getting calls for the last 2 weeks about oak wilt suspect trees in my area, and my colleagues in other parts of the state are getting those as well. So this picture here shows oak wilt at a landscape level. This is a photo I took of the Sterling Fire Tower, which is down in Polk County. Took this photo back in 2014, and you can see it shows oak wilt affecting trees across the landscape scale here. The kind of grayed out crowns here of trees, and then also some of those that are showing reddening are those that are actively wilting. The gray ones are either have lost their leaves from this year or in prior years. And what we can see is the disease is spreading across the landscape pretty aggressively. This is a type of habitat where oak wilt is the most problematic. In that area of the state in Wisconsin has a lot of issues with oak wilt for a few different reasons. In particular, soil type is very sandy. Oaks tend to be of the northern pin oak type, so they readily graft to one another. And there's not a lot of other species in some of those sites besides oak, which leads to a good degree of continuity between those root systems. So kind of a worst case scenario of what oak wilt can do. The good news is oak wilt is usually not that bad, depending on soil type and some of those background factors. And we'll get into some of those things that predict how aggressive oak wilt can be here in this talk. But as far as the pathogen biology, oak wilt is a vascular wilt disease, and it's caused by a fungal disease, the scientific name being Bacillia fragaceum. And this causes mortality in red oaks and occasionally in white oaks and often in bur oaks. In red oaks, the symptoms, once they start to appear, a tree can die within a matter of 4 to 6 weeks after the symptoms are onset. This disease was really first identified in Wisconsin back in about 1942, but surveys of by the general by GLO, the General Land Office, I think it is, indicated that there were oak mortality centers as far back as the 1890s, which suggests that oak wilt may have been on the landscape as early as the 1890s, but it really started to become more widely recognized in the 1950s in Wisconsin, and since then we found it in a lot of the counties. In fact, almost all of the counties in Wisconsin, and a lot of areas in Minnesota too, reaching into northern parts of Minnesota. The origin of oak wilt, this fungal disease that kills red oaks really quickly, the most aggressive disease of red oaks that we have for sure in Wisconsin and Minnesota, has an uncertain origin. The current evidence suggests that it's probably an exotic pathogen. Some of the evidence is based on phylogenetic and population genetic analysis, which show that the oak wilt pathogen doesn't vary too much in its genetic makeup. It seems to be quite similar between different areas where we find it, different stands and different counties. There's a lot of similarity suggesting that it hasn't had a whole lot of time to evolve here in Wisconsin, which means it probably was introduced. At least that's what the current pathologists think. There's some other things with its sporulation habit that suggest it may be an exotic. The fact that it produces these sporulation mats underneath the bark is different than the native ceratocystis pathogens that we have in Wisconsin. The other thing is it really doesn't, trees don't have co-evolved resistance to oak wilt, meaning that the trees can't well defend themselves against this infection once it starts. They're sort of naive to the infection, which suggests that they haven't had hundreds and hundreds of years to develop adaptations at basically the physiological level to cope with oak wilt. And overall, the historic incidence of oak wilt has been very sparse. There hasn't been a lot of evidence of oak wilt's presence until around the 1950s and beyond. And so that helps us think that it's probably pretty relatively new in the scope of the state's history. Just in the bottom there, I just show you real quick on that last slide, is a petri dish with oak wilt spores growing in it. And then a slide on the right there next to it is an endoconidia chain. Those are the spores, what they look like up close. And those are what travel through the vascular system of these trees once they become infected with the disease. They're almost like little seeds that break off chains of spores that break off and travel through the channels and conducting tissue of the tree and are part of the reason the tree dies and wilts rapidly. So as far as oak wilt's presence in the greater part of the US and the Midwest, you can see here in the yellow, the overall extent of oak wilt as of 2018. And this map is probably updated a little bit since then, but you can see oak wilt is really widespread. It's been a huge problem down in Texas where it's killed millions of the live oak species, and then in the Midwest too. And you can see in that darker color up at the tip of Wisconsin there, that's new detections as of 2018, that we still have new county level state records as of late. We don't have a lot of counties left that have not been infected or a positive record, but we are still seeing the northern march of oak wilt for sure. In Wisconsin specifically, we can see here that these red counties are those that have a relatively high abundance of oak wilt. They're counties where we no longer track oak wilt at the township level because we don't necessarily assume, but we have a good estimation that it's probably out in most of the townships, and that it's not really worth tracking at that township level anymore. And also because the township level information has an implication for how we manage oaks in a forested setting. So what we can look at now is those pink squares, and what those are 6 by 6 mile township areas where we are still tracking oak wilt by the township level to determine at what point we might switch the county to more of a red color. And it has some implications again for the management in forest settings. But you can see in Douglas County, Bayfield County, for sure Burnett and Polk County, a lot of oak wilt in those latter two counties, and to some extent now in Washburn and Sawyer, we're seeing it kind of the new, if not epicenter, it's sort of the leading edge of oak wilt in the northern part of the state. And so we're trying a lot to get on top of this by through early detection, through working with landowners to control it when we have infections, and to work with foresters and loggers so that they can put on some of the prevention steps to slow the spread of oak wilt. There's a good reason to do this here in Wisconsin because we have an abundant oak resource, and it's a high valued resource in terms of the economic value of oaks, the ecological value of oaks, and also the aesthetic value and kind of historic and cultural value of oaks. There's a lot of reason to care about this disease, and you can see on this map here in that kind of lighter color of I guess yellow, you can see the abundance of oaks is pretty, I guess more on the light end on that lighter color. But when you get into areas around the Blue Hills and parts of the Meteor Hills and in Sawyer County, parts of southern Bayfield County and Washburn County, the oak densities in northwest Wisconsin really pick up. And it really is clear if you ever get out on any of those county lands, be it Washburn County, southern Bayfield County, that in Rusk County for sure, in the Blue Hills, that oak is really it's a big deal. It's a big deal for the management of these forests, for wildlife management, for timber management, and landowners just love their oaks. It's a really great resource. There's a lot of it, but we are now dealing with a challenge, and that's oak wilt. And so as we continue on, we'll talk about some ways to continue to combat that. So I'll talk a little bit about the biology right now. We kind of glazed over that a little bit, talking about oak wilt is probably an exotic fungal pathogen. But I'm going to start the disease cycle in fall here. And I'm going to point out that wilting tree that you see on the top, you can see the leaves are kind of turning brown. If you look up toward the top of the crown, it looks like the leaves are kind of getting thin. They're probably falling from the tree at that point. That tree has been infected with oak wilt and is now dying rapidly. We are getting spores and conidia chains of spores spreading in those vascular tunnels and vessels of the tree. and they're basically clogging up the tree's water conducting tissues. And so the most difficult part to get water is usually at the top of the tree, which is furthest from the water source, the roots. So we start to see symptom onset initially at the tips of the crown, and also I'll show you in some subsequent pictures, not yet though, that we can see it showing up on the edges of the leaves too, which is also, in a sense, the outermost portion of the tree's anatomy. So once the tree dies of oak wilt, what we tend to see happen is that the following spring, the trees will produce spore mats underneath the bark. And if you look at that lower picture on the right, you can see a vertical crack going down the bole of that tree. And what that's being caused by is this gelatinous mat forming on the sapwood, which is pushing out the bark. It's a spore mat, which is the fungus's version of a mushroom. It's a reproductive structure which is producing spores and giving off a fruity odor. Well, why a fruity odor? We'll get to that here in the next point. So there you go. We've got the pressure pad on that top left photo. That's that spore mat. And these form all the way up and down the stems of trees that died the previous summer from oak wilt. That spore mat forms, it puts a crack in the bark. That crack is just big enough to allow picnic beetles to smell that spore mat. Picnic beetles maybe in the area, they're common and they're native to Wisconsin. They smell that spore mat, smells kind of like juicy fruit or like kind of like a wine, kind of a fruity wine smell. They come, they visit that spore mat, they might feed a bit on the spores, but then they collect spores on their body inadvertently. And then if there's an oak injured within the area, typically within about 1/3 of a mile, they can fly. They're weak flyers, these beetles, you can see in that photo there. They have spores on their body. They're going to fly to an injured oak. An oak might be injured for any given reason. It might have been logging damage, such as that top picture on the right, where as a tree was felled, it scuffed into another tree and ripped off the bark. We might have a pruning injury where you're trying to get a little bit more clearance out of your driveway, and so you prune off a couple of limbs, maybe at the start of July or the end of June, to get a little bit better view of the oncoming traffic, and you've left a wound in your tree. You might have a stump that got cut and now is susceptible to these beetles flying and visiting it. What do the beetles want with these wounds? What are they doing there? Well, the beetles can smell that sap, and just like they want to come and feed on that oak wilt spore mat because it might be tasty and there might have some opportunities there for courtship and other things of that sort, they're feeding on the sap that comes out of those wounds, the pruning wound, the stump, the scuff on the tree. They're trying to get access to some resources, and when they do that and land on that wound, they inadvertently deposit spores on it, and boom, that tree becomes infected too. So once oak wilt gets into that tree, and we tend to see that cycle of the disease where spores are produced and beetles carry those spores, we tend to see that most abundantly around April through July. Once a tree becomes infected with the disease, now we've got a second problem. We don't have just that tree dying from the disease, rapidly wilting within 3 to 5 weeks, and then producing spore mats the following spring, which lead to more of this, what we call overland spread by the beetles. But now we also have set up a situation where we may have below ground transmission through grafted root systems. Oaks growing near one another up to 15 meters, so figure 75, 85 feet away from one another, can graft their roots together to share resources like nitrogen, phosphorus, water, other things of that sort. We're finding out miraculous things about trees as we learn more, that they actually have a lot of cooperation. They work together in kind of a strange way. But in that too, there's also a liability, which is that not only are you sharing good beneficial resources, but if you're grafted to your neighboring oak, you might be sharing and transferring disease as well. And that's what we tend to see, is that once a tree gets infected and it's growing close to another oak tree, it spreads the disease below ground. And so what we see is that these hyphae, both the strings of those chains of spores, you can see in that bottom picture, the hyphae, and the spores themselves are like little seeds that float around in the transpiration stream, and they end up in the neighboring oak. And guess what? Within a year or a couple of years, that tree that received some of that inoculum or spores ends up getting infected, and the disease cycle continues on. These neighboring oaks may die within a year after the neighboring tree next to them died, or it may take 6 years. It depends on a few factors, but we tend to see some variability, but if a tree is root grafted to another oak, one of them dies, high likelihood that the neighbor is going to end up contracting the disease. And that becomes a crucial item when we consider how we can control oak wilt in forests. This radial expansion I talked about kind of varies based on a few factors. We can see spread up to 3 to 25 feet per year in Wisconsin. And it sort of depends on the soil type. On sandy soils that have northern pin oak growing on them, like that picture of the Sterling Fire Tower I showed earlier, we see really rapid oak wilt spread. We see it more on the 25 feet per year, moving outward in radius. On heavier soils like those around Sawyer County, Rusk County, Blue Hills, Southern Bayfield County, it's a little bit slow. It's quite a bit slower, in fact. I've been tracking several trees now for the last 3 years that are adjacent to, within 20 to 30 feet of an oak that died back in 2016, and they still haven't shown symptoms yet. That doesn't make me think that they're not going to ultimately get infected in the next couple of years, and I haven't been out to see them yet this year, but it's just a matter of time, most likely, and it shows that there is variability in this rate of below-ground spread, mostly driven by distance from one another and by soil type and topography. So the disease can persist in these root systems for a while. I think up to 6 years, or it says 4 years here. 4 years, this disease can persist in these root systems of a dead tree. So if you don't see your tree next to the neighbor that dying this year, it doesn't mean you're off the hook. And the good thing is there might still be time to address the infection. So a couple of ways to look at that. We do see with oak wilt that the hosts, including, the red oak group, which includes northern red oak, northern pin, and black oak, versus the bur oaks and swamp white oaks versus the white oaks, have a little bit of differential susceptibility to oak wilt. They're not all equally prone to it becoming infected with oak wilt, nor dying from it. What we see is that the red oak group super susceptible to oak wilt, whereby when they get infected, it's usually a really quick death. They just don't have any physiological mechanisms to cope with oak wilt as it moves throughout its vascular system, and they die within several weeks to a month. When it comes to bur oaks, we've been getting reports from Minnesota that they're seeing that bur oaks may not die as quickly from oak wilt, but they die at a high percentage. So I'm a little cautious with this middle picture here that's moderately resistant bur oaks. I would say bur oaks probably are not moderately resistant. They're maybe slightly resistant. But then we get the white oaks on the far right here, and we do know white oaks are quite a bit more resistant to oak wilt than the red oak group and then the bur oak group. And we think that there's some anatomical features of white oak that allow for it to be more resistant. I won't get into a lot of that detail, but suffice it to say, there is a spectrum here. So oak wilt symptoms are those that show up usually in the canopy of the tree. Now, this is a systemic disease, so what you're going to be looking for as a property owner and as a forester is symptoms showing up at the tip and top of the crown or outer portions of maybe, say, the middle of the crown first. That's where symptom onset is going to occur because that's the distance most further, that's the area of the tree most distant from the source of water. And so you can just start to see here in this photo, the initial bronzing of leaves starting to show up. Leaves are starting to look a little bit droopy. If you look toward the left of that upper image there, you can kind of see more twigginess in that crown, which demonstrates that leaves have been shed at this point. The tree doesn't know it yet, but it's dying. And so one of its responses is to shed its leaves. Why would it do that? Well, leaves have a lot of surface area with stomates. Stomates are little microscopic holes that allow moisture to exit from the tree and allow carbon dioxide to come in so the tree can create sugars. Well, if you lose your leaves, you might be losing those tissues that are facilitating rapid loss of water from your system. So maybe it's an adaptation. Let's lose our leaves. Let's try to shelter in place here and overcome this stress that we're facing. Well, the problem is that it's not really overcomeable. It can't be overcome, I should say. The tree ends up dying. But the thing to look for is this rapid leaf loss here. When you see these leaves on the ground, you're going to look for a particular symptom on them. And this photo is not the best, but you can see if you look at the outer portions of that leaf around the margin, that you have a little bit of that bronzing coloration and a little bit of a green coloration toward the midrib or middle vein of the leaf. There's a fairly distinct demarcation between the bronze and the green, and that is a fairly signature of oak wilt. There are a couple of other diseases that present themselves similar to that, but if you see that on trees that are losing leaves in the middle of July through September, very suggestive of oak wilt, and it is worth following up with some other possibly tests. Another photo on the left here showing that leaf loss from the crown, upper crown downward, and then a photo at the top, I guess in more detail showing that what we call marginal wilt or bronzing going on there. Heavy leaf drop on the ground. One thing you can look for, though I don't find this to be as reliable, is vascular streaking in the branch. You can see this branch that's been peeled on the bottom of this slide here, and it shows a little bit of a darkened coloration there, a little bit of streaking of brown black, maybe brown blackness to it. Well, that's changes that are occurring in the wood as a result of the fungus moving in and destroying that wood tissue. And so that can be a sign of oak wilt. But more in particular, what I would do if I was really trying to test and didn't know for sure, I'd probably collect a sample of that twig there, or that branch, and I would probably have that sent in and have it tested for a genetic test or a culture test. So talked a little bit about the spore mats and what they look like. It's a little tough to get your eyes on these unless you have a little bit more experience and have dealt with oak wilt, because those cracks on the left photo don't show up that well. You have to kind of inspect the tree and look for them closely. And to be honest, oaks don't always produce these spore mats. So sometimes I've seen trees that won't produce the spore mats. More often than not, they do, but not all the time. When you see those cracks there, you actually have to remove the bark and expose the sapwood to see those spore mats that are underneath. And once you see those, that's a positive field diagnosis of oak wilt. There's really nothing else that looks like it in the field. So we can basically safely say at that point, when we see something like that, that your tree is infected with oak wilt, no doubt about it. Rachel mentioned earlier that there's some other things that look like oak wilt, and it's true. There are quite a few of them, and so my job becomes difficult at points in the season to identify oak wilt from other commonly and sometimes not so commonly affecting agents here. The scattered mortality that we see in stands is not caused by oak wilt. Remember that picture from Sterling Township that I showed where oak wilt was spreading across kind of a landscape, and it looked fairly continuous. The symptoms of red and the symptoms of gray crowns were basically connected to one another. In this photo, though not a great photo, it shows that these trees that are showing a little bit of that yellowness in the canopy are a little bit more scattered apart. It's more of a peppering across the forest canopy there. And so what that is implying is most likely oak wilt is not the cause, because we know oak wilt spreads radially through these connected root systems. More likely it's something else. And if you go to the next slide here, the agent that causes symptoms like that is called the two-line chestnut borer. And this is a photo of an exit hole that the two-line chestnut borer produces. It's a domestic cousin of the emerald ash borer, but it is native. It's native to chestnuts and oaks in the U.S., and it will kill them. Particularly trees that have been stressed out because of excessive or insufficient soil moisture, those that have suffered from defoliation, or consecutive years of frost damage due to a late spring frost that kills the new shoots. Various things that stress trees out can lead to two-line chestnut borer infestation. And so one of the things we might see with two-line chestnut borer, an oak wilt mimic, is this sort of galleries or tunneling underneath the bark, where we see that the larvae have been creating feeding tunnels, and they're girdling the tree. They're preventing flow of nutrients and water through different portions of the tree, and that helps to basically kill the tree over time, usually within a few years once it starts. A little bit closer picture of what those two-line chestnut borer look like. Now, this is important here. That photo on the left here, I think is fairly iconic, and it's a good representation of the difference of what we expect to see with two-line chestnut borer versus oak wilt. Remember those photos with oak wilt? I showed you that the crown was starting to wilt out from the top down. If you looked at this photo, you might conclude a similar thing, that, well, most of the leaves are gone from the top, and those toward the bottom are still green. But the thing with this is that this tree probably had symptoms in the crown last year, and now what we're seeing is we're seeing a progressive dieback where the symptoms of browning and leaf loss are moving down the tree at a much slower pace. Whereas oak wilt will kill the tree and cause leaf shed and drop within usually a month. Most of the leaves will be off a tree after the trees become infected with oak wilt. Two-line chestnut borer is a lot slower. This is a bark beetle that bores in, kills portions of the branches, and over a few generations, a few successive years, ends up killing lower portions of the tree. And so there's a way to sort of remember this, in that when you look from the bottom of the crown or bottom of the tree upward, you tend to see a pattern in leaves in a progression of symptoms that is a green, red, and dead. Now, green is the green leaves you still see at the base of the crown. Red are those in the middle of the crown, and dead are those at top that it's just dead branches. There's really not a lot of leaves left. The other thing is that these leaves are kind of retained on the crown. They're hanging on. They're not dropping immediately, which is cueing us that, as opposed to oak wilt, which we know causes leaves to fall readily and quickly, two-line chestnut borer usually causes oaks to retain their leaves for whatever reason. The mechanism is not clear to me, but they don't emphasize their leaves the same way. So if you see an oak that seems to be in a slower decline, it was kind of declining last year, it's still alive, it may be getting a little worse, you can almost for sure rule out oak wilt as a causal factor, at least if it's a red oak. If it's a white oak, it could be oak wilt, but if it's a red oak and it's more progressive and slower, almost for sure not oak wilt. More likely it's going to be two-line chestnut borer or one of the other common agents. So, okay, questions?
I just wanted to give you a time check. We just have a few minutes left, so.
Yeah, time really escaped me here. So if we just jump into a few more slides here, I'm going to just break this down on the best ways we can prevent oak wilt, because that's really the million-dollar question. You own oaks, potentially, you have land. You're wondering, well, what do I do about this oak wilt thing? Do I have it? And if I don't, how can I prevent it from arriving at my property? The biggest thing you can do to prevent oak wilt on your property or your neighbor's property, if they're interested, is to prevent damage to oak trees, be it pruning, wounding, or cutting oaks, April through July of any given year. That's the time by which these picnic beetles, which spread the spores from those dead oak trees, that's the time that those beetles are most abundant, in the time that those trees are most susceptible. So avoiding injury can go a long way in preventing oak wilt. Now, calling the right resource when you think you have oak wilt is a great idea. Getting your tree tested, talking to an expert, that can help you prevent more losses from oak wilt if oak wilt is in fact infecting your tree. And so consultation with an expert and proper diagnosis, a really big thing with oak wilt. I think we have one more slide. Firewood precautions. The other thing you guys can do is be careful about what firewood you're bringing around to your property. Firewood is a huge source of oak wilt spores in new areas and accounts for the arrival of oak wilt in new areas. And so what we strongly recommend is that people keep firewood local, not carrying firewood from your house in, say, I don't know, Virginia or somewhere else in Wisconsin, Minnesota, over to Stacy, maybe it's Stacy, Minnesota, where there's a lot of oak wilt, over to a cabin in Burnett County. So that, or vice versa. Keeping firewood local goes a long way to prevent new arrival of oak wilt infected wood. There's beetles everywhere on the landscape. They're just waiting to take advantage of the opportunity. Don't give them that advantage by bringing wood around. So that's another thing. And then I think ultimately, if you guys own property, anyone here owns woodland and they're interested to learn more about oak harvesting and prevention of oak wilt, the DNR has a really good resource called the Oak Harvesting Guidelines that has a whole lot of information on how to prevent oak wilt and how to manage stands in a sustainable manner that meet both economic, ecological, wildlife objectives, while still preventing oak wilt from arriving, because forest management done soundly on oaks can achieve a lot of different objectives, but done at the wrong time or without the knowledge of how to prevent oak wilt can lead to disaster. I've seen it a number of times where people's whole stands have been undermined because they just didn't know. They just didn't have the information. So I would kind of close off with that and let you know, just remind everyone that there's a lot of good resources out there. The Wisconsin DNR website has a slew of information, and I will put on the Forest Health newsletter sign up onto the chat box, and I will welcome any questions if we have time left, or I guess I'll turn it back over to you, Nikki, to moderate.
Yeah, of course. I think we can squeeze in a few questions if you guys are okay staying just a few minutes later. Okay, so if you haven't done so already, feel free to type your questions, and also please answer the survey that I put in the chat box. So thank you, Paul, John, and Rachel for talking with us today. It was a lot of great information. Now let me read just a few questions here, and I think this one is for John. When you're going through a few of your slides, how old are the deer protected oaks that you showed? I think you showed a few that were several feet tall, and also how fast do baby oak trees grow?
Good question. So the first couple of years they stay pretty low. They're less than a foot tall, and then if they have the right conditions, they start to put on some pretty good growth. Like I would say, we're anticipating having those cages on for 7 to 10 years. We hope that they're above deer height by that time. If they have really good conditions, I've seen 3-year-old oaks that are about shoulder high, but just kind of depends on where they're growing and what kind of conditions they have.
Okay, great. And we have one question, I think, for you as well, John. Is the estimate of cost per acre for oak reproduction protection?
Yeah, for our caging system, it turns out to be about $10 per tree. We typically do about 240 trees per acre, so that turns out to be about $2,400 per acre for the caging and the rebar.
And then, is there any advice on digging up and transplanting oak seedlings that are growing in the wrong place?
You'd have to do that early. They have you saw that long taproot. So anything beyond 2 years old, I would be hesitant to move. They just get, it just sets them back too much when they get that taproot cut.
Mm-hmm. And this could go to both speakers potentially. Will oaks be adaptive to climate warming, or should we focus efforts on providing trees for the future, unlike other tree species, planting other tree species?
I can start on that a little bit. So we're kind of on red oaks and white oaks extend, their range extends a lot further to the south. So we'll still will be a component as things kind of shift northward. We are starting to mix in a little like bur oak, a little more drought resistant, things like black walnut, and we're trying on small places and shade bark hickory. But those, I think we'll still be all right with oak. I'll turn it over to Paul if he has anything to add.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I'm not as privy to the information in the latest on climate change predictions and natural migration of species, but last I think I heard oaks might fare quite well in a changing climate, a slightly warming climate here in the northern Great Lakes region. I think it is interesting, though, that we are seeing additional spread and the distribution of oak wilt is expanding, because while oaks may fare a brighter future in terms of the climate suitability and in terms of, basically climate suitability, I think that the constraint that the disease may impose does put into question how well oaks will do. It depends on how widespread oak wilt becomes, but it will, if in ecological terms, it will be another limiting factor, and it might constrain what ultimately is the realized niche of oaks in this area, just because, while they might do well, the disease might hold them back a little bit. But to be honest with you, in the North Woods here, where the soils are heavier, the terrain is a little bit more hilly, more rocky, I've seen oak wilt manage pretty successfully in this part of the state. So I think when we get on the sands, when we look at areas of the Northwest Sands, Bayfield County, down in Burnett County, St. Croix River area, it's little bit more difficult to control oak wilt for sure, because it just spreads so rapidly and we have such a high background level of it. So I think it depends on where we're talking in the state as to how well oaks will do in the future, more purely from a disease opportunity and constraint standpoint.
Okay, great. And I think this one is for John. Have you had any success or ever tried leaving slash behind from the shelter wood harvest to discourage deer browsing and encourage regeneration?
Yeah, there just isn't enough of it to the deer. We just have so many deer that they get around it. If it isn't caged, like we have, they just come from every angle. So if there's any trail leading into it, they're gonna get there. So unfortunately, that doesn't work in our area. Oh, did I have myself on mute there?
Oh, sorry. I think I had myself on mute. Thank you.
Okay.
The next, I think one more question and then we will call it a day. Does tarping wood really prevent the spread of beetles?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I'll address that and back up a little bit. So we're not really preventing the spread of beetles. The objective and purpose of tarping wood down, and when we say tarping, what we're doing is we're taking a tree that died of oak wilt during the previous growing season, and we're expecting that that oak tree and the wood material down to about 2 inches is likely to produce and form spore mats on it. And so we know that wood, if left unchecked, is going to be sitting in the environment, might be standing as a tree, it might be felled, or it might be cut up into firewood, even stacked. But we know that even stacked firewood is likely to produce these spore mats. And so the purpose of covering the wood is in covering it down to the ground level, where we dig a couple inch trench and bury that tarp or that plastic down and cover it, is to prevent beetles from sniffing out the wood and from then visiting any spore mats that form on that diseased wood. And if they can't get in and visit the wood, then yes, we've effectively prevented beetles within the immediate area, within the neighborhood, or say stand scale, within a third of a mile, from having spores that they otherwise might. And so the landowner might say, well, but what about other firewood in the area? Well, there might be other firewood in the area that's been contaminated that your neighbor didn't deal with. But if you get a storm in your area, happen to get a storm in the middle of June this year, and no one's done anything with that infected wood, your neighbor might have some wood out there, but you're going to have less spores out there in the environment being carried around. And so it's a not all or nothing situation. It's sort of on a spectrum. More spores, worse than less spores. And so if there's no spores at all, that's even better. And maybe you're the only one with an infected tree. Covering that wood can go a long way to prevent those beetles from accessing it and spreading those spores. So the answer would be yes.
Great, thank you guys. And I think that concludes the webinar for today. If you have any more questions for our speakers, they provided their email, I think, in the chat. And also, if you forget their email, you can email me at info@mystcrowwoods.org and contact them through that way, and I'll get you through the right connections. So thank you for joining today, and have a wonderful day. Thank you, guys. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.